It was September 26, 1986, and Metallica had just finished performing at the Solnahallen Arena in Stockholm, Sweden. The show had been electric. 18,000 fans packed into the venue, screaming every lyric, headbanging to every riff. For a band that had started just 5 years earlier in a garage in Los Angeles, this European tour was proof they'd made it. Cliff Burton, Metallica's 24-year-old bassist, had been particularly on fire that night. His bass solo during For Whom the Bell Tolls had been ferocious, a thundering display of technical mastery that left the crowd in awe. Burton didn't play bass like other metal musicians. He played it like a lead instrument, incorporating classical music influences, jazz techniques, and a level of musicianship that elevated Metallica above every other thrash metal band of the era. After the show, the band was exhausted but energized. They had one more show scheduled in Copenhagen, Denmark, which meant an overnight drive through Sweden. The tour bus, their home away from home for months now, was waiting outside the venue. But there was a problem. The sleeping bunks on the bus were notoriously uncomfortable. Some were near the bathroom, where the smell was unbearable. Others were by the engine, where the noise made sleep impossible. And a few unlucky bunks were positioned where cold air leaked in through poorly sealed windows. The best bunks were in the middle of the bus, away from noise, smell, and drafts. On most nights, the band members just took whatever bunk was available, but tonight, someone suggested they settle it fairly. Draw cards. High card wins, first choice. James Hetfield, Metallica's frontman and rhythm guitarist, drew first, a 6. Kirk Hammett, the lead guitarist who'd replaced Dave Mustaine 3 years earlier, drew next, a 9. Then it was Cliff's turn. He reached into the deck and pulled out the Ace of Spades. The Ace of Spades, the death card. In symbolism and superstition, it's associated with mortality, fate, and bad luck. But in card games, it's the highest card in the deck. Cliff had won. He looked at Kirk Hammett and grinned. "I'll take your bunk, Kirk," he said. Kirk had been sleeping in one of the premium spots, a bunk in the middle of the bus, away from all the problems. Kirk shrugged. "Sure, man, it's all yours." It was a small moment, barely worth remembering, just a card game between friends on a tour bus. But that single decision, that one card, would change everything. The band loaded onto the bus around 2 a.m. James Hetfield chose a bunk near the front. Lars Ulrich, the drummer and co-founder of Metallica, settled into his usual spot. Kirk took the bunk he'd given up to Cliff, and Cliff climbed into Kirk's old bunk, the one he'd won with the Ace of Spades. The tour bus pulled out of Stockholm and headed south toward Copenhagen. The band members, exhausted from the high-energy performance, quickly fell asleep. The rhythm of the road, the hum of the engine, and the darkness of the Swedish countryside made sleep come easily.
What none of them knew was that their bus driver had been driving for hours already. Some reports later suggested he'd been drinking. Others claimed he'd simply fallen asleep at the wheel. The official investigation would cite black ice on the road as the cause of what happened next, but band members would later dispute this explanation, noting that the temperature that night was well above freezing. Whatever the reason, at approximately 6:47 a.m. on September 27, 1986, on the European route E4, about 12 miles north of Ljungby, Sweden, the tour bus began to slide. Cliff Burton woke up to the sensation of the bus swerving violently. In those few seconds of consciousness, he probably felt the bus tipping. He probably realized something was catastrophically wrong. And then the bus flipped. The sleeping bunk Cliff had won, the good bunk in the middle of the bus, was positioned right next to a window. As the bus rolled over, that window shattered. Cliff's body was thrown through it. The bus continued to roll, once, twice, tumbling across the highway and onto the grass beside the road. And then it came to rest, on its side, on top of Cliff Burton's body. James Hetfield was one of the first to crawl out of the wreckage. Dazed, confused, and in shock, he looked around at the overturned bus and the debris scattered across the highway. Other band members and crew members were emerging from the wreckage, some injured, some in shock, all trying to understand what had just happened. And then someone screamed, "Where's Cliff?" Hetfield walked around the side of the bus and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Cliff Burton's body was pinned beneath the bus, crushed by the weight of the vehicle. His bass-playing hands, the hands that had created some of the most innovative metal music ever recorded, were visible, reaching out from under the bus. Hetfield later described walking up and down the highway in his socks and underwear, frantically searching for the black ice the driver claimed had caused the accident. He found nothing. The road was clear, the temperature was above freezing. There was no ice. But at that moment, the cause didn't matter. All that mattered was getting Cliff out from under the bus. Emergency services were called. A crane was dispatched to lift the tour bus off Cliff's body. The band members, crew members, and first responders stood in the cold Swedish dawn, waiting, hoping, praying that somehow Cliff had survived. The crane arrived. The operator positioned it carefully, attached the cables to the bus, and began to lift. The massive vehicle slowly rose off the ground. Everyone held their breath. And then the unthinkable happened. The crane slipped, the cables gave way, and the bus came crashing back down, directly onto Cliff Burton's body a second time. There are conflicting accounts about whether Cliff was already dead from the first impact or if the second impact killed him, but the result was the same. Cliff Burton, 24 years old, one of the most talented musicians in heavy metal history, was dead. The band members stood in shock. Kirk Hammett, who'd given up his bunk to Cliff just hours earlier, felt a crushing wave of guilt and survivor's remorse. That had been his bunk. If Cliff hadn't won that card game, Kirk would have been the one under the bus. James Hetfield's grief manifested as rage. He confronted the bus driver, demanding answers, wanting to smell his breath for alcohol. The driver insisted he'd hit black ice. Hetfield walked the highway again, now fully convinced there was no ice, that something else had caused this. Negligence, exhaustion, something preventable. Lars Ulrich simply couldn't process it. Just 8 hours earlier, he'd been playing drums behind Cliff's thundering bass lines, watching him command the stage. Now his friend and bandmate was dead on a Swedish roadside. The local police arrived and conducted an investigation. The bus driver maintained his story about black ice. The investigation concluded that weather conditions were the cause and no charges were filed. But decades later, a Swedish detective who worked the scene revealed that the skid marks on the road looked exactly like those caused when a driver falls asleep at the wheel, not like the marks left by a vehicle sliding on ice. The truth of what caused the accident remains disputed to this day, but the result was undeniable. Metallica had lost their bassist, their friend, and one of the most innovative musicians in rock history. The news spread quickly through the metal community. Metallica's tour was immediately canceled. Bands and fans around the world mourned. Anthrax dedicated their album Among the Living to Cliff. Dave Mustaine, the guitarist Metallica had fired in 1983, heard about Cliff's death and immediately sat down and wrote the music for In My Darkest Hour, a Megadeth song that, while not explicitly about Cliff, was created from the pain of losing a friend. Cliff's body was flown back to California. His parents, Ray and Jan Burton, were devastated. Their youngest son, the quiet kid who'd fallen in love with classical music and then taken that love into the world of heavy metal, was gone. At Cliff's memorial service, Metallica played Orion, the instrumental track from Master of Puppets that featured Cliff's most beautiful and melodic bass work. The song was Cliff's masterpiece, a composition that showcased everything he could do: technical proficiency, emotional depth, classical influences, and raw power.
Cliff's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at the Maxwell Ranch in California, a place he'd loved. The lyrics from another Metallica song, To Live Is to Die, written partially from unused recordings Cliff had made before his death, were engraved on his memorial stone. "Cannot the kingdom of salvation take me home?" For Metallica, the question became, what now? The band members were devastated, grieving, and unsure if they could continue. Some suggested that Metallica should end with Cliff, that it wouldn't be right to replace him and keep going. But after several difficult conversations, the band decided that Cliff would have wanted them to continue. He'd devoted his life to this music, and ending Metallica would make his death mean the end of everything they'd built together. They held auditions for a new bassist. Dozens of musicians tried out, but the band ultimately chose Jason Newsted from the band Flotsam and Jetsam. Newsted was talented, energetic, and understood the enormous shoes he was being asked to fill. He would never replace Cliff, no one could, but he could help Metallica move forward. The band threw themselves into work, channeling their grief into music. Their next album, And Justice for All, was darker and more complex than anything they'd done before. The title track was an 8-minute epic about injustice and corruption. One, inspired by the anti-war film Johnny Got His Gun, became one of their most powerful songs. And To Live Is to Die incorporated bass recordings Cliff had made before his death, making him a posthumous contributor to the album. But Cliff's legacy extended far beyond the music he'd recorded. His approach to bass playing influenced an entire generation of musicians. Before Cliff, bass in heavy metal was largely a background instrument, something that provided rhythm and low-end power, but rarely took the spotlight. Cliff changed that. He played bass solos that sounded like classical compositions. He used distortion, wah pedals, and effects in ways no metal bassist had before. He made the bass a lead instrument. Musicians like Robert Trujillo, who would eventually become Metallica's bassist in 2003, cited Cliff as their primary influence. Steve Hyden of Iron Maiden, already an innovative bassist himself, called Cliff's work revolutionary. Even musicians outside of metal recognized Cliff's genius. In the years following his death, tributes to Cliff appeared everywhere. Metal Blade Records released a compilation called Cliff 'Em All, featuring rare footage and performances of Cliff with Metallica. Fans made pilgrimages to the crash site in Sweden. In 2006, a memorial stone was erected at the location where Cliff died, funded by Swedish Metallica fans. In 2022, a full museum dedicated to Cliff Burton in Ljungby, Sweden, near the crash site. The Cliff Burton Museum features photographs, memorabilia, interviews with first responders who were at the crash scene, and a recreation of Metallica's last performance with Cliff, including replicas of his bass and Lars's drum kit from that night.
The museum also displays something particularly poignant: photographs of the last autograph Cliff ever signed, giving to a fan in Stockholm just hours before the crash. Kirk Hammett, in interviews over the years, has spoken about the survivor's guilt he carried for decades. "That was supposed to be me," he said. "I gave him that bunk. I've thought about that moment a million times." But he's also said that Cliff wouldn't want anyone to carry that burden, that Cliff would want the focus to be on the music and the legacy, not on the guilt. James Hetfield has been more private about his grief, but in the 2004 documentary Some Kind of Monster, he opened up about how Cliff's death affected him. The loss of his friend, combined with his mother's death from cancer when he was a teenager, created deep emotional wounds that Hetfield carried for years and eventually addressed through therapy. Lars Ulrich has called Cliff's death the day everything changed. He's said that Metallica's evolution from a thrash metal band into something more experimental and diverse was partly driven by Cliff's death, that losing someone so innovative made the remaining members want to keep pushing boundaries, to honor his spirit of musical exploration. The crash also led to changes in how touring musicians travel. Many bands began implementing stricter rules about tour bus drivers, including mandatory rest periods, prohibition of alcohol, and regulations about how long drivers could be behind the wheel. The music industry, which had long treated tour bus safety casually, began taking it more seriously. In 2009, when Metallica was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Cliff Burton was inducted posthumously as a member of the band. His parents, Ray and Jan, accepted on his behalf. Ray Burton spoke about his son's passion for music and how proud he was that his work continued to inspire new generations of musicians. The bus stop near Cliff's memorial stone in Sweden was officially renamed in 2022 to Cliff Burton's Memorial Stone, ensuring that even in this small Swedish town, his name and legacy are permanently remembered. Today, more than 38 years after his death, Cliff Burton remains one of the most influential bassists in rock history. His work on Master of Puppets, Ride the Lightning, and Kill 'Em All continues to inspire musicians. His bass solo on Anesthesia, Pulling Teeth is still used as a teaching tool in music schools. And his approach to metal, treating it as a genre worthy of classical technique and sophisticated composition, helped elevate heavy metal into an art form.
But beyond the technical achievements and the musical innovation, Cliff Burton's story is a reminder of how fragile life is and how a single moment can change everything. A card game on a tour bus, the Ace of Spades, the lucky bunk. 6 hours. That's all it took for fate to turn a victory into a tragedy. Kirk Hammett would later say, Cliff was the soul of Metallica. He brought a level of musicianship and creativity that pushed all of us to be better. Losing him was like losing a part of ourselves. James Hetfield added, we think about Cliff every time we play. He's still with us, in the music, in the way we approach our craft. He taught us that metal could be beautiful, complex, and powerful all at once. And Lars Ulrich perhaps said it best. Cliff Burton made us believe we could be more than just a thrash band. He made us believe we could be artists. That legacy didn't die on that highway in Sweden. It lives on in every note we play. The Ace of Spades. In poker, it's the most powerful card. In symbolism, it represents death and fate. On September 26, 1986, it was both. Cliff Burton pulled that card, smiled, and won a bunk on a tour bus. 6 hours later, he was gone. But his music, his influence, and his legacy remain immortal, proof that even the shortest life can leave an impact that echoes through eternity.